Let's get to the actual issues. What do we mean by localization? The term got a lot of traction in the build-up to the World Humanitarian Summit and has become firmly established since, not least as it's one of the main areas of focus of the Grand Bargain. However, the concept is not new. We've known for a very long time that local communities, civil society organizations, local NGOs, local authorities are the first responders in a crisis. They're also the responders which continue their engagement throughout the crisis and remain in the area with affected people, accompanying affected people, after the worst impacts of the crisis are over. What is new, though, thanks to the World Humanitarian Summit and the Grand Bargain and the whole framing of this agenda as a localization agenda, is the attention which is brought to local and national actors and their work, and all the work which is being done to get them better recognized and supported by international responders, recognizing their essential contribution to an effective response. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome our two panelists who are going to share their insights on this important topic. And I will start with welcoming Dr. Jamila Mahmoud and Philippe Besson, who are the two co-chairs of the Grand Bargain Localization. They're going to give us their perspectives on progress made in recent years, challenges that still exist, and what they think is needed to overcome these challenges. Dr. Jamila Mahmoud is the Undersecretary General for Partnerships at the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, and she's been in this position since 2016. Before that, I'm sure a lot of you knew her as the Chief of the WHS Secretariat. She's also very well known as the founder of Mercy Malaysia, which she led from 1999 to 2009. Her previous appointments include the Chief of the Humanitarian Response Branch at UNFPA, the Senior Fellow at Malaysia's Khazanah National Berhad Research and Investment Strategy Division, and Senior Visiting Research Fellow at the Humanitarian Futures Programme at King's College in London. In 2006, she was one of 16 members appointed by the UN Secretary General to the advisory group of the Central Emergency Response Fund, which you probably know as CERF. Philippe Besson is the head of the multilateral division of the Swiss Development Corporation, SDC, which is located in the Federal Department of Foreign Affairs of Switzerland. He's been in position since August 2017. His division oversees Switzerland's relations and contributions to UN humanitarian organizations and to the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement. It also manages and coordinates Switzerland's contribution to disaster risk reduction and to the promotion of resilient societies. Philippe Besson has been with SDC since 1990, with extensive experience in field operations and development policy, in particular development effectiveness. He has worked in Bern, in Dhaka, in Niamey, in Paris, and Juba. He's managed SDC programs in India, Turkey, Poland, and Palestine. Thank you very much, Jamila and Philippe, for being with us today. I'm going to ask the first question to Jamila. Jamila, localization is not a new idea, although it has gained momentum in the lead up to WHS, and it's a key commitment in the Grand Bargain and an underlying objective for all humanitarian operations. From your perspective, do we have evidence that localization delivers a quality, timely, and accountable humanitarian response? Do you think it achieves better results in certain types of contexts?
Thank you, Kate. Sorry, there was a bit of a delay. Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and thank you, Ocha, for organizing this very important IASC peer-to-peer support webinar. Your question, Kate, I want to answer in two ways. One, you asked about does it deliver where's the evidence that it delivers quality, timely and accountable humanitarian response? I think there is a lot of evidence, but even before you come to evidence, let's put ourselves into what really happens after a crisis, whether it's a disaster, whether it's a conflict. Who comes first? And normally it is neighbors, it is community leaders, it is, church groups, religious groups. It is, the community that actually responds to what's needed on the ground. So let's not forget that they may not be called local actors or local NGOs, but they are part of the communities and they are the first responders. And normally there are a lot of volunteers, as someone speaking from the Federation, our volunteers are on the ground because they're embedded in communities. So from the outset, they're there. Now, in terms of the evidence, I think we've seen, and we can divide it into, disasters coming from natural hazards. We've seen, for example, in Asia, Typhoon Haiyan, Cyclone Nargis, where it is the local actors who have been on the ground. And when I say local actors, it's not just limited to civil society, but it's also local businesses, local governments, and so on and so forth. We saw that as well in many of the ongoing crises. You see that in Indonesia right now, in Lombok, in Sulawesi, where it is really primarily driven by national and local actors. On the other hand, in health crises like the West Africa Ebola response in 2013, it was really local actors. For us, we can say it was our local Red Cross volunteers who were carrying out safe and dignified burials that really stopped the transmission of Ebola. It was, local civil society, local volunteers who went out to talk to families and who understood the culture, who could explain to them what Ebola was, build the trust with the community so that humanitarian actors, both international and national, could do their job, including governments. Now, we know, for example, in conflict settings or in complex disasters, in Somalia, it was the Somalia Consortium of NGOs that really played a very active role in addressing the needs over there. And similarly now, ongoing in Bangladesh, in Cox's Bazar, you will see that there's a very strong role played by local actors, whether they are Red Cross or whether they are civil society groups. You have Coast Bangladesh, you have Nawab, and others who are really doing a lot of very good work. I can just share with you that the recent localization workstream field visit to Bangladesh focused on both Cox's Bazar as well as natural hazard-prone areas, and really showed the group, they were donors, they were humanitarian actors, what the important role that local actors play. So I think there is enough evidence that they have been very active, they have been there on the ground, often not seen and not heard. Only of late, partly because of the World Humanitarian Summit, but and certainly brought to the attention of many more people now through that and through the Grand Bargain that we are having this discussion today.
Thank you very much, Jamila. That's very comprehensive. Building on the last point and the complex crisis that you've talked about, we know that there can be a tension between localization and a principled response in conflict contexts. How do you think, in your experience, can this tension be most effectively dealt with?
Okay, on this issue, I'm actually quite struck by the fact that every time we talk about principled humanitarian action, we seem to have a almost automatic default opinion that local actors are less principled. And I think we have to really start tackling this this dichotomy of international being principled and local not being principled. And let's face it, even as international actors, we are being challenged to carry out principled humanitarian action. We know it's critical. We know that's what will protect the people we serve. We know that's what's going to protect our aid workers. But day in and out, our principles and our humanitarian principles are being challenged. And we've heard horror stories about how this has played out on the field. I think that what is really important is that how do we make sure, and we must acknowledge, and I will acknowledge, that yes, there are many local actors and national actors that may have problems trying to stand up to their governments and their leaders, but it doesn't mean that they can't do the job. And I think we need to find a way to play that complementarity role. Now, I want to give you the example during the World Humanitarian Summit consultations in Africa and Pretoria. You know, we had one amazing speaker, and I remember her. She was Sister Letitia from Uganda, I believe, and she stood up and she said, "We need you. We are local actors on the ground. We are the ones doing the work, but we need you, international actors, to sometimes be the advocates and to help us when it becomes really, really difficult for us to navigate some issues within our governments." So I think complementarity is key. How do we find the balance? How do we make sure that local action can also be principled? You know, what does humanitarian principles mean to a local actor? For us in the Red Cross, is simple because it's the basis of the foundation of our national societies. But I think we need to do a better job at really educating and engaging local actors as well on standards, on principles, and so on and so forth. You know, and I just want to share, perhaps from my own personal perspective, you know, our Red Cross movement, in certain contexts, because we have the ICRC, IFRC, and the national societies, we have to see who leads in certain areas, because obviously the host national society is in the lead, but ICRC in complex settings will play a bigger role in leading the movement, at least on the global level. Now, the similar argument, I think, is also on accountability, where, you know, again, if it's local and national, is less accountable than international. And you and I know that, you know, integrity, transparency, accountability, fraud, these are things that we will all face. And the more complex the situation we're working in, the more risks we face. I think the dialogue must be changed towards how do you ensure a much better risk management approach to some of the difficulties we face in the field, and how do we then make sure each of these actors can play their role?
Thank you very much, Jamila, for that. There's a lot of food for thought, and I'm sure we'll come back to some of it in the questions from the participants. I'm now going to move to Philippe. Philippe, do you think that humanitarian organizations are really the best placed organizations to support national and local capacities when effectively their main task is to deliver a rapid and effective response to people that need life-saving assistance? Do you think the humanitarians have been effective or have the potential to be effective in terms of capacity support, capacity development? What do you think they should potentially be doing differently? Philippe, I understand you may still be on mute. Please unmute yourself so that we can hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, this is great. Thank you very much, Philippe.
Some technical hitches, but it's
great to have you with us.
First of all, hello everybody. I think it's really a great opportunity to exchange all across the world about the issue, which is central. To your question, Kate, it seems to me that increasingly there's a recognition within our ecosystem that we need to be much more people-centered. And Jamila alluded to the recent disaster on Sulawesi in Palu. It so happens that we've had a very immediate experience as Swiss Humanitarian Aid, which was that we wanted to assist. So we sent out a first team of 5 people. And first of all, they saw government at work, but behind the government, there was a national society, which was doing basically all the right things. So in fact, the answer is very clear, and it would be valid, I think, for any type of international cooperation beyond humanitarian aid. If we want to be effective, if we want to be efficient, but also if we want to promote the dignity of the people we want to accompany and to support, then we must partner up with national actors. And it is in our own interest in terms of delivering as effectively as we can to team up and to work through and with national actors. So I think in a way it's almost tautological. It's true also that our action and practice may be also guided by a complex set of purposes, reasons for intervening. We are official agencies and we are part of the foreign policies of our respective governments. And that's where certainly the Grand Bargain is helping us a lot in terms of giving us sort of a reality check. And on the other hand, assessing in terms of peer reviewing the progress we make. We still have some leeway or some way to go in terms of really precisely walking the talk, but I think, as Jamila has already illustrated, the evidence is there. Humanitarian aid, effective principled humanitarian aid of the present and the future will increasingly rely on local actors. There's no doubt about that, I think.
Thank you very much, Philippe, and thank you very much also for bringing the whole people-centered approach in this discussion. A second question, the Grand Bargain states that at least 25% of humanitarian funding should go to local and national NGOs as part of its localization commitment, and specifies that this funding should be as direct as possible. What does this mean in practice, and are you seeing progress in meeting this commitment?
Well, in fact, there is strong evidence that people take their commitment very seriously, and we see that there is progress. 61% of signatories reported actions under the work stream. We have organizations like Christian Aid, also IFRC, UNICEF, WFP, and ILO, who have been reporting allocating more than 25%. Canada has changed its way of doing business, if I may say so, in the context of the Rohingya crisis. There's also the ACT Alliance's Rapid Response Fund, which is now available to Southern ACT members, and there are the CBPFs. I could witness myself in South Sudan how increasingly, as regards the country-based South Sudan fund, there was, I stayed there from 14 to May 17, and you could see the level of awareness, but also of commitment from OCHA, but also from the contributors, really, really increasing. Because I go back to my first argument, it does make sense. You deliver better and you deliver more effectively if you channel in that way. Of course, there are issues like basic fiduciary conditions which are not negotiable, but experience shows, and I think that's really the good news from the reporting, that these are not really obstacles. They are part of developing a partnership. So there is basically no limit to what we can achieve, depending on the context in principle, precisely. But Of course, that's always also a matter of getting to know each other and also raising trust. I'm also struck by how the element of trust, which will be introduced also in the 33rd conference of the Red Cross Crescent movement, how this element of trust has become also central beyond the norms, which we can change. At the end of the day, it's about trust and taking a reasonable risk on both sides, by the way, because if local actors engage with funders, they know they will enter a relationship with terms and conditions, which they will have to respond to, and this element of choice and finding each other, I believe, is really important, and it has been documented in the reporting. So obviously we are on the right path.
Thank you very much, Philippe. I'm hearing a lot of food for thought from both of you. I'm hearing that the evidence is there that localization really contributes to effective action, that it helps promote the dignity of the people that we're trying to work for, that it ensures that we're there over a period of time. You've identified a few challenges that we're making progress on but still need to be overcome. I've heard risk management and I've heard trust very strongly. I'm going to ask both of you to answer the following question, maybe starting with Jamila. What do you think are the remaining barriers, and what do you think are the practical ways of addressing these to really improve the representation and the leadership of local and national actors in actual humanitarian coordination and humanitarian leadership? Over to you, Jamila.
Okay. I think the first thing we need to acknowledge is that a lot of the coordination mechanisms have been designed with international humanitarian actors in mind, and that's traditionally been the design. And I think that, maybe the first thing we need to think about is, do we need a drastic rethink on what coordination is going to look like from now to the future, especially since, national local actors, need to play a central role. So I think, first of all, it's a design issue, and really find, and of course it's very contextual. There may be instances where it will be an international-led response. It will require that kind of mechanism. How do you find a hybrid model, for example, that can suit both? So I think we've got to start thinking about, how we collectively redesign what coordination means for everyone. The second thing is, we have to acknowledge that for many local actors, coordination mechanisms are very intimidating. There are language barriers. There are real, jargons that are used in the humanitarian space, and then there's very little space for them. Normally, the local or national actors are asked last, what they think about. I think, and I think that it takes so much time. I mean, having been in many coordination meetings in the past, in many different humanitarian situations, you need almost dedicated people to be sitting in these coordination meetings, and a lot of international actors also give up, right? Because they can't cope with the amount of work and then attending that. So how do we have a much more robust way of coordinating and making it simple? I think the solution is going to be found in the way we communicate, from now into the future. I think we've got to start looking at technology, and we've got to think about, two-way communication mechanisms, clever use of mobile phones, and, extracting and using coordination not for the sake of coordination, but actually for delivering impact on the ground. So really rethinking what is the end thing that we want. What we want at the end is people are given or have access to information, their needs, cash, whatever, and then what then would fit in that context. So I think a one-size-fits-all, will not be fit for future.
Thank you very much, Jamila. Philippe, do you have some thoughts on this in complementarity to what Jamila has suggested?
Well, what comes to my mind is that, and again, I go back to the recent Indonesian example, the humanitarian world is really changing. On the one hand, we have donors, as we call ourselves in our call, who need some visibility. They need to find a form of accountability towards their public, their political masters. That's one element. On the other hand, I think all, or if not all, the immense majority of those who are involved in humanitarian aid mean to do the work seriously and really act in a principled manner. So this means that increasingly the system will have to listen at what people want and how they express their needs. And there again, the Indonesian case is really blatant. I think part of the humanitarian system, and I wouldn't necessarily exclude Switzerland, started working and acting, responding in what I might call the traditional way. And then, for those who reached Indonesia, they immediately sensed that the rules of the game, if I may say so, had changed, because we were having capable interlocutors who knew pretty well what they needed and how they needed it. And I think that's a very healthy situation. So it makes sense that we find a way of revisiting the kind of automatic power relation we tend to postulate or to establish, and it makes sense for us very rapidly on the donor side to reflect on the latest experiences. Having said that, in terms of the remaining barriers, and that was the first part of the conversation, or an element of that, we need really to understand each other about what we mean by being principled, but also what we mean by adhering, all of us, to the same set of basic standards. And then the other element of the recipe is what Jamila has said. It's contextual. There is no one recipe for all. So each time we will have to check on. It's a paradox, no? In emergencies, we want to act fast. We need to respond fast. But on the other hand, in fact, we should take the greatest precautions to first listen at people and what partners or potential partners want to tell us. And in the end, it's also an issue of attitudes and behaviors. It sounds like a very soft concept, but beyond the technical standards, it's also about how we establish and foster a conducive relationship.
Thank you very much, Philippe, for these very thoughtful inputs. What I'm hearing is that the humanitarian system is changing. We need to rethink the power relations. We need to rethink how we coordinate. We need to rethink how we communicate. We need to be able to better contextualize. And we need to really review the issue of attitudes and behaviors. Building from that, I'm going to ask both of you the question, but again, I'll start with Jamila. We will only achieve progress, and this is a question from one of our participants, we really achieve only progress if we are able to move away from transactional partnerships between international and national actors Do you see any progress in that area? How can we be more systematic about no longer looking at subcontracting, but really looking at equal partnerships within our sector? Over to you, Jamila.
That's a really good and important question. As Philip mentioned earlier, this is about power dynamics. It's about the imbalance in power between international and local and national. So I think if we are even going to move the needle on localization, we've got to acknowledge that and really try to address it. So absolutely, we have to cut this whole transactional relationship and really make it one of true partnership. We have principles of partnership that have been developed, by ICVA, by others. We have the Charter for Change, commitment to local actors. I think there are already solid, principles that are already in place. What we need to do is start implementing them and really being compliant to them. I think that, that respect and power balance, if we can achieve it, then it can really go a long way and really move the system forward. Otherwise, it will just remain the same.
Thank you very much, Jamila. Philip, from a donor perspective, a lot of the transactional relationships are often, reasons given for these are often that the funding is short-term, we have no long-term visibility, it's really difficult to invest in a long-term relationship. How do you think we can really move away from this transactional approach to something much more equitable and balanced in our relationships?
Well, I'd say first, again, we have to ask ourselves, and it has to do about evaluating ourselves, being evaluated, assessed, and really taking stock of what's actually happening when we put money into an endeavor, when we respond to a crisis and emergency. And experience shows that a purely transactional relationship, sheer subcontracting, leads potentially to very serious issues, because a purely alimentary income relationship will tend to increase. I think there is evidence to prove that the fiduciary risk, because the element of commitment, of a common set of values that does not appear and is not part of the equation and the relationship. In a way, I'd say what's important is for funders, sponsors, donors to exercise restraint, i.e. to very purposefully not go beyond what are the necessary and sometimes partly compulsory terms and conditions of their engagement. And I would argue local responders, actors, they also need to learn sometimes to say no. It's a very difficult one, because the incentive on both sides to just go ahead is important. But I've seen that. I've been in development cooperation for the best part of my professional life, and then a little more than 3 years in South Sudan. I have seen so many, by the way, good people and good organizations coming to us and asking, what is your template? And then wanting to fill the template. And on both sides, we really need to care more, I would argue, about the beginning of the relationship, which may become a partnership or not. But it's like this basic notion of being people-centered. Even in the greatest emergency, the way you are going to interact with the people is going to be significant in terms of preserving their dignity and also to all the extent possible their autonomy. And that's a continuum. The same applies if we want to do our job properly for the whole chain, including the type of relationship, contractual and beyond contractual, we establish with local actors.
Thank you very much, Philippe. I think there's a lot of very important points in what you've said. I do like the points about learning to say no, which I think also probably applies to international actors. But it is difficult when the balance of power is so unequal. As a follow-up question, do you see that do you see that the country-based pool funds can play an important role in the future of humanitarian financing as a result of the new commitment to fund as directly as possible to local actors? And is this one way of potentially rebalancing the power dimension and enabling more equal partnerships?
Yes, I think country-based pool funds are already and may be a very important, if not vital, instrument in the future. And there are several reasons to that. I witnessed one functioning, and Switzerland contributed to it. That's the one in South Sudan. And what could you see there? First of all, the transparency in terms of the threshold, the conditions, in terms of solid systems, bookkeeping, all the things that are also important in terms of accountability and transparency. Those terms and conditions, they were laid on the table. Anybody who wanted to access could know what it was about. There was in the background the NGO forum that would contribute to capacitating the local actors, the ones who really wanted to engage, and if I may say so, do their homework. Beyond that, you were having contributors from countries that were not represented in South Sudan, so they would give money knowing that the setting and the terms and conditions and the procedures were right. There were some important donors who had a representation on the spot, and in a very difficult environment, it was obvious that the advisory board meetings one would have, these were also occasions to do a reality check, including with the recipients of CBPF monies on what really was happening in the field. So it was really a mutual benefit. It was also helping donors to do the right things. And finally, that was the place that made it, or one of the places that made it most easy in terms of transaction costs, in terms of being reassured, in terms of risk assessment and all that. It was the place in which we as donors could invest, and we were safe or relatively safe because the systems were in place, they were well managed, and therefore there was sort of an implicit and explicit incentive to contribute. And it seems to me that it can't be again the exclusive model and the exclusive system we invest in. But I'd say in terms of finding common ground and addressing issues, questions on both sides, and then finding the proper agreement, these are really the spaces or amongst the better spaces nowadays in which we can invest for the benefit of the whole system, but of course mainly to deliver for and to the people.
Thank you very much, Philippe. I'm going to ask the same question from Jamila. Jamila, what do you think the pool fund's role can be in support of an effective response and promotion of equal partnerships between national and international actors?
Kate, I think that there's no doubt that pooled funds in any form can actually help donors manage this relationship, right? Because you can't, realistically, donors have come to me to say, how do you expect us to have a relationship with 150 national actors, which is impossible for them. So I think pooled mechanisms are a way forward. But I have reservations about how some of them are being run, right? Because I think there's room for improvement. The country-based pool funds that you mentioned specifically, which OCHA run, I mean, if you analyze it, it's extremely good that there is now this mechanism. It's really, really something good. But look at who's assessing the country-based pool funds. And if you look at it very carefully, majority of them are not local or national actors. And this is for a multitude of reasons. One is it's quite difficult to fill up the forms. It's quite complex. And local and national actors may not have that capacity to do it. So this is where, consortia become really, really important. But I want to make a suggestion as well. I was having a conversation with OCHA recently, and they were proudly telling me, oh, but we achieve even 50%. And I said, where do you achieve 50%? And I said, well, in Myanmar. So I smiled and I said, you know why, right? Because there are not many international actors there. So it's always, because there's no internationals, we'll give it to locals. It's an afterthought. It has to be the other way around. It has to be locals and internationals. But where we might get some progress is really finding a relationship, partnership, capacity developer, manager kind of role in the country-based pool funds that accompanies national organizations or local actors, and maybe having a 5-year framework where after 5 years they have enough capacity to do a lot of things. So thinking about it, it's a journey. It's not going to be, we're not going to be able to address this overnight. It's going to be a journey. It might take 5 years, to develop that. And I think that's where capacity development becomes extremely important as we address localization. It's not about giving funding to local actors alone. It's also about making sure that they have the capacities to actually do the job well.
Thank you very much, Jamila. So a slightly different perspective. I think you both agree that pool funds are a very useful instrument. It's also because it's bringing the funders together as well as the operational actors. But Jamila, you are raising some concerns as to how they're actually being managed and whether or not they're effectively accessible, and suggesting that a component on supporting national actors to actually access the funds should be integral to the pool funds. I'm going to move to a slightly different perspective on localization, which is taking us to another big agenda in the humanitarian sector currently. And the question is for you, Jamila, initially. How do you think localization can support gender-responsive and women-led organizations?
This is it's something that we always have to remember, not just gender, but also people with disabilities and other people who are vulnerable and often unseen. In the Grand Bargain in the Grand Bargain work streams, we actually have a gender focus. And I think it's really important now that we're also looking at how gender is integrated and how women-led organizations can play a really important role. So I think it is extremely important. And similarly, with people with disabilities. I just want to say that, this is something we at Federation are looking at very closely. We are producing our World Disasters Report. It will be out on the 1st of November. And actually, it tells us that even though you have the best systems and the best amount of money around, there will be a group of people who will be left behind and unseen. And they are normally the people with disabilities, the elderly, and so on and so forth. So I think that, we have to keep pushing ourselves to make sure that our lens is broad and we actually see the different groups who are often, even within local contexts, marginalize themselves.
Thank you very much, Jamila. Philippe, there's a lot of questions which are coming again on the whole issue of how to enable or facilitate access to actual funding from for national organizations. Now, one of the major barriers we have discussed is the complexity of the application or the proposal writing. How do you see any progress or any opportunities or any avenues to actually reduce that complexity so that national NGOs find it easier to actually save lives? Do you have concrete examples, or do you see areas which could actually enable that change? Thank you.
Well, the first thing we have to face as so-called donors is that we are bureaucracies. So bureaucracies, they produce templates, and then we have domestic accountability, and then we have this kind of situation in which precisely we distribute our templates and they have to be filled. We, the Swiss, have the privilege when and where we want not to be as tied as other agencies to specific templates and instruments. So what we have been doing, and I think it's not discourteous to mention in this case ECHO, because the ECHO colleagues know that themselves. What we have been doing when we were teaming up with ECHO in a partnership with an implementing NGO was that, be it in terms of the proposal or in terms of the reporting, at least what we could do was to say, okay, we for the Swiss will accept that you report according to ECHO standards, and then for us it's going to be okay, we will accept this in that form. That, generally speaking, where there is a sense of purpose and relevance, we find ways and means. But I'd like to say, and I'll go back to the interesting points raised by Jamila on the pooled funds. I like it best when it's NGOs, when it's civil society that self-organizes itself, and we should support this. It covers capacitation, and in terms of teaming up, building a coalition, acquiring the necessary competencies and capacities. Once this is in place, I think because the tendency is in favor of local actors, and because in this respect the power balance is changing, and partly it's changing rapidly, what the coalitions that have to be built in many times, because there's this tension between coordination and competition, those coalitions, which I hope will emerge, they should engage with donors in precisely a bargain. No, it's that's this element of quid pro quo. We will work with you, together with you, but you'll have to reduce the transaction costs you imply by throwing not necessarily very relevant standards and templates and I don't know what. Again, I go back to this notion that our, in the best case, partners and otherwise implementers, they have to learn to say no to certain demands by donors. And once we are in this different type of discussing and negotiating, I think progress is likely to be very rapid.
Thank you very much, Philippe, for encouraging a sort of revolution from the inside. I think we'll come back to that. I'm going to ask the next question to both of you, but starting with Jamila. Do you think that actually organizational capacity development should be part of all partnership agreements or partnership partnership ways of working between national and international? Jamila.
But I also want to start by saying organizational development is two-way. There's also a role that local and national actors can actually support capacities of internationals, and they have a better understanding of context, culture, and also the ways of working and the networks that are existing. So yes, pragmatically, we could actually, encourage donors to make capacity development of local actors part and parcel of a of a grant. It could be really about measuring the leadership, for example, in the UN, that they are able to actually include X number of local actors or national actors in developing their leadership and capacities as well. And I use leadership a lot because at the end of the day, it is about leadership development. And you have to look at organizational capacity development as a long-term process and not develop capacities for implementation of programs, but really about wholesale, holistic organizational development, which means that, it really has to be a long-term agreement. No, and I think that one of the things we can do, and I keep wondering why we can't do this even earlier, is in every humanitarian response, what is the collective outcome we want, and what is the collective success we have as a humanitarian community, whether local, national, or and then being able to measure the contribution of each of this and really attributing the important roles that each of the components play. So I think these are really important things to consider.
Thank you very much, Jamila. Philippe, what is your perspective on this issue of capacity development as part of partnership agreements?
Well, I think Jamila put it very well. I'll pick up on this notion of a common agency and having a common purpose, a common delivery. And so if we are all aware of the fact that I'll plead for the notion that we are a system, then it's interrelated and we depend on each other to deliver properly. Now, as to the question itself, I would say, perhaps a bit provocatively, that the moment we make it compulsory, it's not going to happen. But working on the spirit, and that's how I understand Jamila, working on what's really important and meaningful, and also document it, then we will realize that it does make sense. But I go back to what Jamila was saying some minutes ago. Every context is different. So if you need to deliver food items to a specific population at a certain point of time, probably it's going to be just about finding pragmatic solutions. But the moment we are in a different logic, there's more time, it's perhaps also a protracted crisis and all that, then this element becomes vital. We just have to ensure that all across the system, that there is a growing awareness that these are the right things to do, not just because it's principles, it's ethical, although I think it's very important, but it simply does make sense. If I were British, I might say it's good value for money, no?
Thank you very much, Philippe. And the last question for you, Jamila. Do you believe that localization can reinforce protection? What do you think are the main opportunities and challenges for local actors to act as protection actors?
I'm so glad we have this question, because core to this is really protection, isn't it? It's protection of the people who are affected and protection of aid workers as well. And I think that local actors, the real opportunities, they really do understand context, and they understand, what is it that we protect. And there's numerous studies, and I hope that the organizers, we have a whole bunch of literature that we can send out on where local and national actors have been pivotal to really understanding protection needs. And I think that I want to give you my own personal reflection. I was working in Darfur many years ago in 2004, and there was this fancy security tree from the UN and international community, and I was in my own little NGO living a bit further away from the UN compound. And I realized that by the time something happens, the time it takes for me to get to the UN compound, probably I might be dead on the way. So what I did was, ask the local community, who are the 3 groups of people who you think are the most important? And they said, well, it's the imam, it's the midwife, it's the headmaster. So we talked to them, and they developed a security tree for us, which we, pasted next to the UN one. So we knew that we could also turn to the local community for our own protection. Now, the other thing is, how about protecting others? And we live in a world now where, whether we like it or not, and I'm glad that, discussions around protection, sexual exploitation, and so on and so forth is coming out now. And I think we see that the international community is being challenged about the, how they've been behaving. And I think it's very important for us to really look at the fact that the international response does not necessarily always give a positive protection outcomes. So yes, let's admit that there are isolated cases. I don't think I want to paint international actors as in one brush. These are individuals who are behaving badly, but we can't stick to the narrative now that only the international protection is important and not the local and national.
Thank you very much, Jamila. I think that's a pretty good way to end. A lot of food for thought, and definitely the notion that without the local community, protection doesn't mean anything really. I would like to remind all of you that the second poll has been out for a bit. Please, please, please fill it up. And before thanking all of you, I'm just going to pick a few points which seem to me to be quite important. I mean, there's a lot which has been said which is very important, but what I'm hearing is that localization is no longer a question, it's a reality. It's a fact that this is something which is important, which enables effective, quality, accountable responses and needs to happen. There's a lot which is happening. We've got a lot of evidence which show it works, but a lot of it is happening in specific contexts or a bit in isolation. And both Jamila and Philippe have really highlighted the importance of looking at the way we work in general completely differently. You've talked about recognizing the shift in power, the need to rebalance power, the need to be able to contextualize our responses and our mechanisms for responses much more. And all of the discussion has really been about collaboration and complementarity, not just between local and international, but also between donors and the organizations that they fund, across donors and across organizations. What I'm hearing, and this is very much building on the points that you have been putting, Philippe, throughout the discussion, is that we have a moment in time where we have the forum, thanks to the Grand Bargain, where aid agencies and donors are actually speaking to each other and looking at a bargain, a give and take on both sides. It seems to me that we've got a moment for civil society to really take that space and be very specific and very clear on what it wants. And I think this is already happening in a lot of contexts where local organizations are organizing themselves and making their voices heard. And I think it's our responsibility at the international level to really make sure that we're hearing these voices. And if we don't, we may no longer be relevant in the future. It is about dignity of the affected people. It's about effective responses. Thank you very much to all of you. Thank you to Jamila and Philippe for your time and your insights. Thank you very much for all participants for being with us all this time. And thank you very much to the peer-to-peer team for enabling all this. Have a lovely end of day wherever you are.